Steven Pinker is the author of a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature. On page 168 of that book, he says that from the late 1600s to the mid-1800s, there was a humanitarian revolution in Europe and in the United States. Cruel practices such as slavery and torture that had existed since the dawn of civilization were abolished. Well, he's right about that, and naturally one has to wonder why the humanitarian revolution occurred. On pages 172 through 177 of that same book, Pinker says the literacy rate rose quite a bit in Europe and the United States from 1600 to the mid-1800s, and this increase in literacy caused people to read novels about the problems of ordinary people. Pinker says that he suspects that this led people to have a greater appreciation for the problems of the poor, the slaves, and the unlucky, and therefore led to public support for abolishing slavery and abolishing other inhumane practices. Well, Pinker is wrong. He's overlooking a crucial fact. The anti-slavery movement in the United States and Great Britain was led by devout Christians. Every single important person in the anti-slavery movements in those two countries was a devout Christian. I dare anyone to name one who wasn't. I've read the books by Pinker and Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and the other big-shot atheists, and they never mention a single important person in the anti-slavery movement who wasn't a devout Christian. Sean Wilentz, a famous history professor at Princeton University, wrote a book a few years ago called The Rise of American Democracy, Jefferson to Lincoln. A very good book, too. I recommend it. Wilentz is spelled W-I-L-E-N-T-Z if you want to look up that book in your public library. Wilentz talks quite a bit about the abolitionists in that book, and he doesn't mention a single one who wasn't a devout Christian. The major figures such as William Lloyd Garrison, Arthur Tappan, Lewis Tappan, Reverend Elijah Lovejoy, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and John Brown were all very religious. You can read about them by going to the index of Wilentz's book and looking up the pages where Wilentz talks about abolitionism. You can also read a biography of Garrison called All on Fire, William Lloyd Garrison and the Abolition of Slavery, written by a man named Henry Meyer. Meyer is spelled M as in Minnesota, A-Y-E-R, if you want to look up that book in your public library. Anyone who reads that book can see what an extremely religious man Garrison was. For the story of the British anti-slavery movement, look at the critically acclaimed book Bury the Chains, Prophets and Rebels in the Fight to Free an Empire's Slaves by Adam Hochschild. Hochschild is spelled H-O-C-H-S-C-H-I-L-D if you want to look up that book in your public library. The important people in the British abolitionist movement, such as Samuel Sharp, Thomas Clarkson, William Wilberforce, and many others, were all religious. Hochschild doesn't mention a single one who wasn't. Now, some atheists argue that the reason why there were no atheists in the anti-slavery movement is simply because there were so few atheists in the world in general in those days. That argument does not hold water. Even though not many people in those days were willing to admit to being atheists, everyone knew there were lots of men who weren't religious, who lived lives of promiscuity, who never went to church. Why is it that men like that cannot be found among the leaders of the anti-slavery movement? King William IV of England had 10 illegitimate children. Obviously, he wasn't religious, but he never criticized slavery. On the contrary, before he became king, he was one of the leaders of the pro-slavery movement in the British Parliament. You can also look at a famous British atheist philosopher named David Hume. He lived in the 1700s, and he saw nothing wrong with slavery. You can read about him by doing an internet search for David Hume and slavery. Hume is spelled H-U-M-E. In the United States, you see the same story. Guys like Aaron Burr, James Madison, James Monroe, Sam Houston, and Daniel Webster were not religious, and they never lifted a finger to abolish slavery either. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, did not get himself baptized until 1862, and one has to wonder if he did it only to enhance his political popularity. You can read about him on page 35 of the July 14, 2011 issue of the New York Review of Books, one of America's most prestigious intellectual magazines. And look at our literary giants from that era. Edgar Allan Poe, Mark Twain, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, and Walt Whitman were not Christians, and none of them were interested in abolishing slavery either. Whitman wanted to keep slavery out of the territories, but that was only because he wanted the territories to be for whites only. He called the abolitionists, quote, a few foolish and red-hot fanatics, unquote. In 1860, he voted for Stephen A. Douglas for president, not Abraham Lincoln. After the Civil War, he opposed letting blacks vote, saying they had, quote, about as much intellect as so many baboons, unquote. You can read about this in a book called Walt Whitman's America by a prominent historian named David Reynolds. I heard some goofball argue once that Herman Melville was an abolitionist, that his short story Benito Sereno takes an anti-slavery position. That is nonsense. Benito Sereno is a well-written short story, but it's about a revolt on a slave ship, and the slaves are depicted as a bunch of cannibals. They kill their owner, then eat him. The heroes of the short story are the whites who crushed the slave revolt. Obviously, Melville saw nothing wrong with slavery. Now, some people may say Frederick Douglass was not really a Christian because there is evidence that he committed adultery many, many times. Even if that is true, one must remember that he became an abolitionist not out of altruism, but simply out of self-interest. Even in the North in those days, it was common for white criminals to kidnap blacks off the street and take them south to sell them. So Frederick Douglass knew perfectly well that he and his children and friends could never be safe as long as slavery existed in the South. Now, obviously, there is nothing wrong with a fellow having the desire to win freedom for himself and his own people. It is perfectly normal for a man to feel that way. But there is nothing terribly noble about it either. Praising a man because he wants to be free is like praising a man because he wants to eat 3 meals a day and breathe oxygen. So I don't see why Frederick Douglass is considered a hero. He just did what any normal man in that situation would have done. Let me also point out that Frederick Douglass was 43 years old when the Civil War broke out, which was not too old for military service by the standards of the time. If he cared so darn much about abolishing slavery, why did he never join the army? Plenty of other black men did. And it is often forgotten that blacks weren't the only slaves in the United States. In the 1850s and 1860s, many Chinese women and girls were kidnapped in China, sent to California, and sold into sex slavery, even though slavery was illegal in California. The women were owned by criminal gangs who bribed the police to look the other way. You can read about this on pages 81 through 87 of a critically acclaimed book called The Chinese in America, A Narrative History, by a lady named Iris Chang. Her name is spelled I-R-I-S space C-H-A-N-G if you want to look up that book in your local library. Christian groups, especially an organization called the Presbyterian Mission Home, run by a lady named Donaldina Cameron, worked to rescue the slaves. Repeatedly, the criminal gangs attacked the Presbyterian Mission Home with dynamite and gunfire, but Donaldina Cameron was not easily frightened. She and other Christian activists rescued approximately 1,500 Chinese slave women over the years. But Iris Chang's book doesn't mention any group of atheists or secularists who ever lifted a finger to help the Chinese slave women. Apparently they didn't care. So Pinker is obviously wrong. The reason why slavery was abolished wasn't because people were reading novels. It was because they were reading the Gospels.